Welcome to Socialist Party Scotland video on the coronavirus crisis, capitalism and the need for socialist planning. My name's Philip Stott. I'm the National Secretary of Socialist Party Scotland. I'm speaking today with Matt Dobson, who's a member of our Executive Committee. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Philip.
The coronavirus crisis has been devastating for billions of people across the world. Tens of thousands have died, millions are infected. Unemployment is increasing faster than any other time in world history. We've got a lockdown that affects around a third of the world's population. The world economy is facing its greatest crisis since the 1930s Great Depression. For many working class people, shock, fear have been the dominant feelings, but there's also now a growing anger as to what has happened, what could and should have been done to prevent the scale of this pandemic, and what it means for the future. In Scotland, tragically, yesterday we had figures that made clear 1,000 people at least have died, including in care homes, the NHS and in the community. Workers up and down the country are rightly up in arms about the lack of protective equipment. NHS and public services are being stretched to the limit, and unemployment and poverty is rocketing. So what does socialists say could and should have been done differently by world governments and capitalism generally to mitigate against this pandemic, which of course was fully predicted by medical and scientific evidence going back years? Matt?
Well, like you've said, Philip, the capitalist class have been late and then they have panicked. The World Health Organization declared a global health emergency in January, and this warning was largely ignored by the advanced capitalist countries. There's been a complete failure to cooperate over combating the pandemic. In reality, there's huge shortages of PPE, for example, internationally, and the capitalists are in conflict with each other. We have had Trump blocking the shipment of PPE from China. If you look at the European Union, the divisions that have opened up between Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands, refusing to bail out countries like Spain and Italy in terms of the financial cost of dealing with the virus. Now, this is rooted in neoliberal capitalist globalization, where you've had massive privatization of health services and public services. Through deindustrialization, you've had the decimation of productive capacity that could have been utilized to manufacture the PPE and the other commodities that were needed in order to fight the pandemic. You've also had the strain on NHS and health services internationally with the privatisation, and for example in Britain and in Scotland with the PFI contracts. Also what you have now is a devastating impact in the neo-colonial world. If you look at the example of Ecuador, where bodies have piled up on the streets, where the authorities have given people cardboard coffins in which to bury their dead. There's been resistance and protests as well in Pakistan, the doctors protesting and demanding more resources, and of course they were beaten by the riot police. In the slums of Manila in the Philippines, there were protests for basic sanitation, for food aid, and of course the authorities responded brutally with tear gas. And what that shows is that we need to put forward demands for the working class and the poor internationally. Socialist Party Scotland and the Committee for Workers International is raising a demand for mass public investment in PPE. Also, for full pay for all workers, no detriment to working conditions. Free public healthcare for all, and mass investment in public sector healthcare. But decisively, what needs to happen is the taking over of the means of production, the commanding heights of the economy into socialist nationalisation and public ownership. And only then really could you coordinate the resources that are needed to protect the majority of the planet from the pandemic.
I think that's a very important point about the demands that we and the working class and the trade unions need to fight for. Because if you look at the actions of the Boris Johnson Tory government at Westminster and the SNP government at Holyrood, they've really adopted the same approach to this crisis, and it's proved to be a disastrous mistake. For weeks, they delayed preparing as coronavirus approached. Herd immunity was the unspoken strategy. But when it became clear that the number of people who would die as a result of not taking action was so colossal, they then abandoned that and employed a lockdown strategy. But it was too late, because it's estimated in Scotland between 100 and 150,000 people had the virus when the lockdown began just almost 4 weeks ago. And it's also clear that a decade of cuts to the NHS, council services, social care, meant resources were becoming overwhelmed. And one of the biggest scandals of all has been the lack of protective equipment for frontline workers. Even now, 7 weeks into the crisis, 7 weeks after the first cases began to be diagnosed in Scotland, there is widespread shortages of PPE, and there's virtually no testing in the community at all. We're seeing private companies jacking up the prices of protective equipment, profiteering actually at the expense of working class people. Care homes, there's been no testing done as far as the staff or the residents are concerned. And it really is a choice at the moment of no PPE, insufficient PPE, or exorbitantly expensive PPE. And that has really been indicated by the crisis in the care home sector, much of which is privatised today. And it's a real scandal as to what is taking place. But it didn't have to be like this. The resources are there. They had to be mobilised to protect workers and the community in general. And that's why it's right for us to point the finger at the actions or inaction of the Tory government on the one hand, and the Scottish government led by the SNP at Holyrood on the other hand, for their role. And also to contrast that to the heroic actions of some of the workers and of the trade unions who've been fighting on the issues of safety and health and safety at work and for proper testing and PPE.
Yes, and a very good example of that has been the Communication Workers Union, who have walked out across Scotland and across the UK in many workplaces for social distancing and also demanding PPE. They've bravely refused to accept the dangerous work practices. And I'd urge our viewers to have a look at the Socialist Party Scotland Facebook page, the interviews with Gary Clark around the question of the walkouts. And also in councils and in care homes, you've had the pressure of the trade unions, Unison, GMB and Unite, who have effectively fought and forced an apology from the Scottish Health Minister, Jean Freeman, around the shortages of PPE, but also the wrong advice about PPE in terms of the whether masks needed to be worn by key workers and who should wear it day in, day out. And the unions are showing how important they are. Even just today, there's an example of a private sector employer, Carntine Transport in the East End of Glasgow, who've been able to win, Unite have been able to win full pay on furlough for those transport workers. And that shows the importance of that, of the unions being able to defend workers on the issue of PPE, but also on the issue of sick pay and full pay as well. And we completely defend the right of workers to take action, to walk out if their safety is threatened. And it's interesting that the Royal College of Nursing has rightly said, as a last resort, they will refuse to treat patients, nurses, if they do not have the right equipment. But of course, we can't just rely on individual workers and trade unionists. The unions nationally need to coordinate action, to act together and demand full pay and protection for workers in this crisis. And that also needs to be extended to the idea of no loss of income for anyone, including the self-employed and including the unemployed and benefit claimants as well. There's no guarantee, by the way, about the furlough payments at the end of April. The government have been extremely slow to respond to the crisis. Now, obviously, in terms of our position with the trade unions, we've had to also warn, as we did in a recent article, taking up the question of the Scottish Trade Union Congress and also the Trade Union Congress as well, because we don't think it's correct to enter into a partnership with the Scottish government and with the Westminster government. We've seen through this crisis that they can't be trusted to deal with a pandemic effectively. In that sense, there is not a national interest with everybody pulling in the same direction. In reality, there are class divisions and class interests being exposed in this crisis. We have to demand the resources that we need as working class people, as workers in the workplace, in communities as well, that we need to effectively fight this pandemic. We can't trust the SNP and the Tories because of their record and because of what they're doing now. Every cut to the NHS, every cut to public services over the last decade has been effectively an obstacle in the pursuit of dealing with this health emergency.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we've also consistently opposed, whether it's from the Tories, from the SNP or Labour politicians, their attempt to carry out austerity and cuts over the last decade. Socialist Party Scotland, as our sister party in England and Wales has done as well, have demanded there should be no cuts budgets to protect health, to protect social care, to protect the public services working class people rely on. But it's been a decade of austerity that has left us in a very, very difficult position as far as this health emergency is concerned. And that's why we point out that it's not only a question of a health emergency, it's also an economic and a social crisis that we are now facing as a result of the mistakes of the politicians and the capitalist politicians in particular. And the idea that capitalism and that the market can protect working class people, that has been undermined decisively, I think, through this pandemic. And it's also raised the issue about the need for public ownership of the resources of society that could be put under the control of the working class, so we can plan for what's needed. We don't leave it to a profit-driven economic system. For them, the question of protective equipment, the question of vaccination, the question of the health resources are secondary. To them, profit is the decisive issue as far as they are concerned. For example, the drugs companies. For example, the privatised sectors in terms of healthcare. We want an end to all forms of privatisation. We want the writing off of all PFI and PPP debts that drain tens of millions of pounds every single year from the NHS in Scotland. Socialist planning is the idea that we could have international cooperation to deal with medical emergencies like this, not competition with each capitalist country fighting each other, effectively cutting their own throats over things like ventilators, vaccinations and protective equipment.
Well, what you just raised, Philip, shows the complete anarchy of the market. The market, the free market, is in reality a dangerous way of running society. And ideas like socialist planning, public ownership as an alternative to capitalism can only grow more popular in response to this crisis. Look at what capitalism means. It means the biggest health emergency in a century. It means the biggest economic crisis since the 1930s. And not to mention, by the way, environmental chaos. Look at the links in the reports between the incidences of COVID and air pollution. Yet, by the way, the COP26 conference in Glasgow that was planned in November, where the capitalist class was supposed to try and sort the environmental catastrophe out, has now been cancelled because of the pandemic. And all the points you've made so far about the lack of cooperation, that will also apply to dealing with the climate crisis as well. Capitalism and the free market cannot solve these problems because they cause the problems in the first place. This is a system that only benefits the billionaires and millionaires. The International Labour Organization predicts that 195 million people will lose their jobs worldwide because of this crisis. That's effectively a new worldwide depression. Production in the United States, it was revealed yesterday in the Financial Times, has contracted to the biggest fall since 1946 in terms of that position. And if you look at the Financial Times, almost every day there are dire warnings with the capitalists terrified about the future of their system. The article by Martin Wolf a couple of days ago saying that the world economy was collapsing. Of course, the capitalists will resort to any means to save their system. And you could see actually state intervention on a colossal scale in order to try and save capitalism. And of course, you might see a different strategy now with neoliberalism being abandoned. The Tories have effectively nationalised the railways. You have a massive stimulus package paying 80% of workers' wages if they are being furloughed. But this is not socialism. This is an attempt to save the system using the resources of the state. And in reality, it will take the form of a bailout for the bosses and their system. But what it does show is that what would really be possible if you took the economic resources, the vast wealth that exists in society, into the hands of the working class. And what was the point that the Amazon strike leader made on Staten Island? He said that workers create the wealth, not the capitalists like just Jeff Bezos and Amazon.
Precisely. And when you look at the issues around public ownership and the stimulus packages and the bailouts and this economic crisis, it's really an anticipation of how important it is to fight for socialist change. Even the measures that capitalism is taking to try and save their system, as you rightly say, it's an anticipation of the invading socialist revolution. The fact that capitalism has abandoned its historic task, which is supposed to be to develop the economy, to develop the productive forces. Today, it can only bring multiple crises, whether that's a pandemic on health, whether it's mass unemployment, whether it's a social or an environmental crisis itself. And it's not for nothing that the pages of newspapers like the Financial Times and others fear what will come after this pandemic. In the words of the Financial Times, widespread social unrest, if not revolution, could be posed. And they do fear that because of the way in which this system has been exposed during this crisis, that many, many working class people across the world will draw political conclusions about the need to change society. And COVID-19 has shown the incapacity of capitalism to protect us. Not Boris Johnson, not Trump, not Bolsonaro, not even Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP leadership have been able to implement the policies necessary to protect workers and the community. And that has been clear. But who has come to the fore in this crisis has been the working class. Who is it that's been delivering in terms of protection? It's NHS workers, it's social care staff, it's our transport workers, the retail sector in the supermarkets, the postal workers, logistics and so on. Collectively, it's been the working class who've delivered to help protect society during this crisis. It's the working class who create the wealth, who deliver the key services. And it shows and it proves in action, particularly during this pandemic, that we should be putting working class people in charge of the running of society. And that could be done by bringing into public ownership the key sectors of the economy, the banks, energy, transport, oil, manufacturing and retail, but put it under not the control of the capitalists, but under the democratic control and management, not of the billionaires, but of the working class as a whole, and do that internationally. And to do that, we need the trade unions, we need working people generally and young people to help fight for that socialist alternative.
Yes, that key question of political representation. We need new mass parties of the working class based on the trade unions with a socialist programme. That is essential. Of course, people look towards Corbynism, and they also look towards the SNP seeing independence as possibly a way out of austerity capitalism. But we have to draw the lessons that neither Corbynism or the SNP leadership were really prepared to face up to what was needed in terms of a break fundamentally with capitalism. The programme that they put forward in terms of Corbynism was at best to try and make capitalism a bit fairer. But of course, it's not possible, is it, to have a nicer, more equal capitalism? This crisis has revealed that and exposed it. Capitalism is full of contradictions. It's a system that thrives on inequality, not equality. And also the profit-driven nature of capitalism means that periodically it descends into crisis. And it's based on exploitation of working class people and the planet, and not on cooperation and planning, which is what is needed. So we need to change the economic and social system to be able to fight for a better society, for a socialist society. That's what we're fighting for. And I'd urge the people who are watching this video today to find out more about socialism and Socialist Party Scotland. You can go to www.socialistpartyscotland.org.uk. You can email us at info@socialistpartyscotland.org.uk, and you can find us on Facebook at Socialist Party Scotland.
Thanks, Matt. And we would just finish this video today by appealing to people, if you're interested in socialism, if you want to find out more about how we can fight back against this rotten parasitic system of capitalism, how we can bring working class people together here in Scotland, internationally, across the globe to fight for world socialism, then get in touch with us at the website, on our Facebook page, email us, drop us a line, etc. Try and find out more about what we stand for. We are a global movement for socialist change. We're part of the Committee for a Workers' International, which fights for socialism worldwide. We will be producing videos every week, so a new one next week. But please, if you like what you've seen here, share this on social media, contact us, join this movement, fight for socialism, and let's change the world. Thanks very much.